The day Elara Calloway decided to die, the mountains did not care. They rose cold and indifferent against a pewter sky, the wind raking through the ponderosa pines like a man dragging his fingers through the hair of someone he no longer loved. It was the autumn of 1874, deep in the Colorado Rockies, and Elara had not spoken a single word aloud in 11 days. Not since she buried Thomas. Not since she packed what little she could carry into a canvas satchel, tied it across her back with rope, and walked away from the homestead on the edge of Ridgway Valley without once looking behind her. She did not need to look behind. There was nothing left to see. She was 26 years old, and she was done. The left leg that had been broken in 3 places when her horse threw her 2 years prior had never healed right. The local physician, if a man who drank more whiskey than he dispensed medicine could rightly be called that, had set the bones crooked, and now Elara walked with a pronounced limp that made every step across uneven terrain a negotiation between her body and the earth beneath her. Going downhill was manageable, going uphill was agony, and the Rockies, as they tended to do, offered nothing but uphill or downhill. There was no in-between. She had chosen uphill. That felt appropriate. She had always been the kind of woman who chose the harder path without quite meaning to. Thomas Calloway had been a decent man. She wanted to be fair about that, even now, even at the bitter end of everything. He had not been cruel. He had not struck her or squandered their savings on cards and liquor the way so many men in those mountain towns did. He had worked the small cattle operation they had built together from almost nothing, had repaired the fence lines and mucked the stalls and kissed her forehead every morning before the sun was fully up. He had been decent. And then, in the space of one terrible October afternoon, a snake bite had taken him from a patch of tall grass between the barn and the creek, and decent had not been enough to save him, because decent never was. The ranch had been mortgaged. She had not known that. Thomas, in his careful, quiet way, had kept that particular weight from her, and when the men from the bank in Montrose had ridden out 3 weeks after the funeral, their faces arranged in expressions of practiced sympathy. She had understood the shape of the thing at last. They had given her 30 days. She had used 11 of them, standing very still inside the empty house, looking at the walls he had built with his own hands, and then she had used the remaining days to understand that there was nowhere to go. She had no family. Her mother had died when Elara was 12, her father 2 years after that. She had a distant aunt somewhere in Ohio who had stopped writing letters after Elara married Thomas and moved west, apparently offended by the westward ambition as though it were a personal slight. There was no one. The women in town had been kind enough at the funeral, had brought covered dishes and pressed her hands and made sounds of condolence, but kindness in those mountain communities had a shelf life, and hers had expired somewhere around the end of the 2nd week. She could not work. Not with her leg as it was. She could not ride, not well enough to drive cattle or make the long distances that work in that country demanded. She was educated enough to teach, having spent her girlhood with books the way some girls spent theirs with dolls, but the schoolhouse in Ridgway already had a teacher, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who showed no signs of going anywhere. And so Elara had packed her satchel and walked up into the mountains, and she had told herself it was because she needed to think. But she had known, in the honest part of herself that did not traffic in comfortable lies, that she was walking toward an ending. The cold would take her. The altitude and the hunger and the leg that screamed with every steep step would take her. She would simply walk until she could not walk anymore, and then she would lie down, and the mountains, which had always been magnificent and merciless in equal measure, would do the rest. She found the cave on the 3rd day of walking. It was not much. A narrow mouth in the gray limestone face of a ridge, barely wide enough for a person to slip through sideways, but it opened into a chamber roughly the size of a modest room, dry and sheltered from the wind that had begun that morning in earnest, and was building toward something serious. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since noon. She could smell snow in the air, that particular metallic sharpness that anyone who had lived a winter in the Rockies learned to recognize with the same instinctive alarm as the smell of smoke. She went inside. The floor of the cave was packed earth and loose stone, cold against her palm when she pressed her hand flat against it to lower herself down. Her leg had passed the point of pain sometime yesterday and entered a strange, humming numbness that she suspected was not a good sign. She had eaten the last of the bread and dried beef she had carried from the homestead the previous morning. Her water skin was down to a careful swallow or two. She had a single wool blanket, thin and fraying at the edges, that she had owned since girlhood. She wrapped it around herself and sat against the far wall of the cave, pulled her knees, or tried to, the left leg only bent so far, toward her chest, and listened to the wind begin to moan against the limestone outside. This was it then. This was where it ended. She had expected to feel more afraid. She had expected the animal part of her, the part that had kept her walking through the pain and the cold for 3 days, to put up more of a fight. Instead, she felt something that, if she had been in better circumstances, she might have described as a strange, exhausted peace. The kind of peace that comes not from everything being all right, but from finally stopping the effort of pretending it might be. She closed her eyes. She did not hear him coming. She did not hear anything over the wind that was now shrieking across the cave mouth with a sound like something wounded. The first indication she had that she was not alone was a shadow falling across the thin gray light filtering in from the entrance, and then a shape blocked that light almost entirely, and she opened her eyes to find a man filling the mouth of the cave the way a cork fills a bottle. He was enormous. That was the only word that assembled itself in her exhausted, half-frozen mind. He was enormous in the way that certain things in wild country were enormous, not aggressively, not threateningly, but simply as a fact of nature, the way a particular cliff face is simply taller than you expected, the way a particular tree is simply wider than your arms can reach. He stood at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, perhaps more, with shoulders so broad they nearly spanned the full width of the cave entrance. His coat was elk hide, thick and dark, worn to softness by years of use, and beneath it she could see the layered bulk of a man who had spent his entire adult life doing the hardest physical work the mountains had to offer. His arms, even through the heavy coat, were visibly immense, the kind of muscled mass that comes from chopping wood and hauling timber and wrestling with the uncooperative wilderness every single day. His hands, she noticed, as he ducked his great head to step inside the cave, were enormous too, the hands of a man who had built things and carried things and fixed things with those hands his whole life. His hair was dark brown, nearly black and long, falling to just below his jaw in the careless way of a man who had no one to cut it for him and no particular interest in seeking out someone who would. His beard was full and dark, trimmed by nothing more ambitious than occasional maintenance, and his eyes, when they finally settled on her in the dimness of the cave, were the deep, clear gray of the sky before a storm clears. He stared at her. She stared back, too tired and too cold to be properly afraid, which she understood was itself a concerning sign. "Well," he said. His voice was very deep, the kind of voice that seemed to originate somewhere in his chest rather than his throat, and it filled the cave the way his shoulders filled the entrance. "You are not a bear." Despite everything, despite the cold and the grief and the 3 days of walking toward her own death, she almost laughed. It came out as a weak, involuntary exhale, but it was something. "No," she said, and her voice cracked badly from 11 days of disuse. She cleared her throat. "I am not a bear." He looked at her for another moment, those gray eyes cataloging her with a thoroughness that was somehow not rude, just careful. She watched him take in the single thin blanket, the empty satchel, the leg she was holding slightly away from herself at an angle that minimized the pain, the hollowness around her eyes that 3 days of nothing but cold air and worry will put in a person's face. She watched him reach a conclusion. He did not ask her what she was doing there. He did not ask her name, or where she had come from, or why she was sitting alone in a limestone cave in the high Rockies with November bearing down on the mountains like a judgment. He simply turned back to the cave entrance, ducked outside, and came back inside 30 seconds later with an armful of wood that she had not noticed he was carrying, because she had been too busy staring at the rest of him. He crouched down in the center of the cave floor. His movements were efficient and practiced. A man who had built 1,000 fires, who had built them in rain and sleet and wind and darkness, who could build them in his sleep if he needed to. He cleared a flat space in the earth, arranged the tinder he produced from an inside pocket of his coat, and had a small, steady flame going in under 3 minutes. The warmth hit her like a physical thing. She had not realized how thoroughly cold had permeated her until she felt the first breath of heat against her face, and her body, involuntarily, shuddered with something between relief and pain. He fed the fire carefully, adding larger pieces of wood with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that a fire needs tending before it can tend you. And when it was burning steadily, throwing orange light against the gray walls and the low ceiling, he sat back on his heels and finally looked at her properly. "You are hurt," he said, not a question. "My leg," she said. "It was broken before. It does not heal right." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. "How long have you been up here?" She thought about it. 3 days. "Alone?" "Yes." "What are you eating?" She did not answer. He studied her face, and then he nodded again. And this time, there was something in his expression that was harder to name. Not pity, exactly, because it was too direct and too unsentimental for pity. It was more like recognition. The recognition of a man who had seen hard things and did not look away from them. He reached into his coat and produced a piece of dried venison, roughly the length of her forearm, wrapped in cloth. He held it out to her. She stared at it. "Eat it," he said. "You do not have to explain anything. Just eat." Her hands shook when she took it from him. She bit into it and chewed carefully, and he watched the fire while she ate, with the particular tact of a person who understands that some dignities are best preserved by not watching them be reclaimed. When she had eaten half of it and her hands had stopped shaking as badly, she lowered it to her lap. "My name is Elara Calloway," she said. He looked at her then. "Silas Greer," he said. "Are you a trapper?" "Some. Scout, some. I have a cabin about 4 miles north of here." He paused, something moving behind those gray eyes. "The storm that is coming is going to be a serious one. You cannot stay in this cave through it." She looked at him steadily. "I was not planning to stay through it." The silence that followed was one of those silences that is not empty at all, that is in fact entirely full of the weight of what has just been said and what it means. She watched him understand. She watched him decide what to do with that understanding. He did not flinch. He did not recoil with the discomfort of a man who has blundered into something he would rather not deal with. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and he said very quietly, "I see." "Then you understand," she said, "that I do not need rescuing." "Maybe not," he said, "but you are eating my venison." She looked down at the dried meat in her hands. Despite the weight of the moment, that almost laugh threatened again. "That's a fair point." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up another octave, something howling and elemental and serious. The fire crackled and sent a thread of smoke curling upward toward a natural fissure in the rock that drew it out of the chamber. He had known, she realized, that the cave would draw smoke upward. He had chosen his spot deliberately. He had been here before. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," he said at last. His voice was careful and measured. "I'm not going to make you go anywhere, but I'm going to stay here tonight because that storm is going to be very bad, and I would rather not freeze to death either." He paused. "And if you are still alive in the morning, and you want to come back to my cabin, then I will carry you if your leg cannot manage it." "Why?" she asked. He looked at the fire. "Because it is the right thing to do." It was such a simple answer. She had expected something more elaborate, some kind of argument or appeal to her better nature or her sense of survival. The simplicity of it disarmed her completely, broke something loose in her chest that had been locked very tight for a very long time. She felt her eyes fill, and she looked away, toward the firelit wall, and breathed slowly until the tightness passed. They did not speak much after that. He added wood to the fire at intervals, read the needs of the flame with the instinctive fluency of a man who had lived by fire all his life. She ate the rest of the venison and drank from the waterskin he offered without ceremony. The warmth spread through her gradually, the way warmth does when it has been absent long enough that the body has almost forgotten what it felt like, a slow, spreading reminder of what it meant to be alive. She did not mean to fall asleep, but she was warm, and she had not been warm in 3 days, and the exhaustion was a living thing that had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment. Her head drooped against her chest, and then she was gone. She woke once in the dark hours of the night to find that the fire had been rebuilt, and that someone had laid a second blanket over her, a heavy buffalo robe that smelled of pine and cold air and the particular earthen scent of someone who lived entirely outdoors. Silas Greer was sitting on the other side of the fire, his back against the cave wall, his long legs stretched before him, his eyes closed. Even in sleep he looked substantial, like something the mountains themselves had assembled from their best materials. She watched him for a moment, this enormous stranger who had walked into her death and built a fire against it, and she felt something stir in her chest, not the comfortable warmth of the fire, and not the complicated grief that had been her constant companion for weeks, but something else, something tentative and new and entirely unexpected. She pulled the buffalo robe closer, closed her eyes, and went back to sleep. Morning came gray and ferocious, the storm having arrived in full force some time before dawn. The wind was extraordinary, a sustained, battering assault that made the cave mouth sound like the inside of a bellow. Elara woke to find Silas standing at the cave entrance, peering out at what appeared to be a wall of white, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression thoughtful. "It is bad," he said, without turning around, apparently having registered her movement in that alert, peripheral way of men who had spent years in country where a sound behind you might be significant. "How bad?" she asked. Her voice had recovered somewhat overnight. She shifted carefully, tested her leg. The cold was in it like iron. "Bad enough that we are not moving until it lets up. Could be a day, could be 2. He turned from the entrance. In the daylight, gray as it was, he was even more striking than he had seemed by firelight, not in the polished, symmetrical way of a man who had ever spent time thinking about his appearance, but in the raw, unpolished way of something that has been shaped by hard use into a kind of inadvertent perfection. His jaw was set and certain beneath the dark beard, his eyes sharp and clear, his massive frame relaxed in the deceptive ease of a man whose body is so thoroughly capable that it rarely needs to exert itself. "I have more wood," he said. "I will keep the fire going. We have enough food for 2 days if we are careful." He paused. "How's your leg this morning?" "Cold," she said honestly. He nodded. He came to the fire, fed it, and then, with the same matter-of-fact practicality that seemed to characterize everything he did, he said, "If it is all right with you, I'm going to look at it. I have set bones before, not a physician, but I have done it." She hesitated. Her leg was exposed to the knee where her skirt had ridden up during the night, the crooked line of the old, improperly healed fracture visible even through her stocking as a kind of wrongness in the line of the bone. "It cannot be reset now," she said. "It healed. Wrong, but it healed." "I know," he said, "but there may be things I can do. Build you a proper brace, help with the pain." He looked at her steadily. "May I?" No one had asked her permission for anything in a very long time. The simple courtesy of it pierced her in an unexpected place. She nodded. His examination of her leg was careful and gentle in a way that seemed at odds with the size of his hands, the way that very large and powerful things are sometimes capable of a precision and delicacy that surprises you. He felt along the bone, pressed gently at intervals, asked her where it hurt and how it hurt, and whether the numbness was new or old. She answered him honestly, surprised to find that she could. He listened with an attention so complete it felt almost old-fashioned, as though she were the only thing in the world worth listening to. "The bone healed in about 15 degrees of rotation from where it should be," he said at last, sitting back. "That is why you limp. It puts the weight wrong. There is nothing we can do about the bone without breaking it again and resetting it, and that would need a real physician." He paused, his expression considering. "But with the right brace and the right boot, something built to accommodate the angle rather than fight it, you could walk with much less pain. Maybe no limp with time." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I had a horse once," he said, without any particular drama, "that broke a leg on a rock slide, and I could not bring myself to shoot her. Set it myself, badly, same problem. Took me 6 months to figure out how to shoe her so she could work again." He met her eyes. "She lived another 8 years. She did not know why that story, a man and a horse on a rock slide, 6 months of stubbornness and care, should hit her the way it did. But she felt her throat tighten in the way it had not in weeks, not the cold, numb grief of the past month, but something warmer and more dangerous. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me yet," he said. "I have not built the brace." They were trapped in that cave for 2 days and 2 nights, while the storm raged with the kind of absolute conviction that the Colorado mountains brought to everything they did. Silas kept the fire going with an almost supernatural steadiness, disappearing at intervals into the chaos at the cave entrance and returning with more wood each time, snow-dusted and unhurried, as though the blizzard were simply weather rather than an event. He shared his food without calculation, not dividing it into portions and monitoring the division, but simply offering things when they were needed, the whole enterprise conducted with a natural generosity that made no theater of itself. She told him about Thomas on the second day. She did not plan to. She had told no one the whole of it, the snake bite and the bank and the mortgage and the 30 days that had become 11 days of standing in a dead man's house and 11 days of walking uphill. And she found herself telling it all to this enormous, quiet man who sat on the other side of the fire and listened to every word. He did not offer platitudes. He did not tell her that time healed, or that Thomas would have wanted her to go on, or any of the comfortable, hollow things that people say in the face of grief because silence seems inadequate. He simply listened, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is a very heavy thing to carry alone." "Yes," she said. "You do not have to carry it alone," he said, and then seemed to catch himself, as though the words had come out more plainly than he had intended. He looked at the fire. "I just mean, there are people, not no one. There is still some good in people. Are you good people, Silas Greer?" He considered it seriously, without false modesty. "I try to be," he said at last. "I do not always get it right." She believed that answer more completely than she would have believed any more polished version of it. She told him about her leg, too. The full story, the horse that had been spooked by a rattlesnake, the fall, the physician who had smelled of whiskey and set the bones with shaking hands, the 2 years of pain and limitation, and the slow erosion of the self that had always moved freely through the world before that day. She told him what it had cost her, the independence, the ability to work, the sense that her body was her own reliable companion rather than an unreliable adversary. She had not told Thomas all of this because Thomas had carried enough without being asked to carry her grief about her leg as well. Silas listened to this too, and when she was done, he said, "What did you do before the leg? What work did you love?" It was such an unexpected question that she blinked at him. "I love to read," she said. "I used to want to teach. I had a year of school teaching in Missouri before I married Thomas and came west. I was good at it." "You could still teach," he said. "The school has a teacher." "That is one school," he said simply. "Colorado territory is full of places that have no school at all." She looked at him. He shrugged, a slight movement of those enormous shoulders, as though he were simply stating geography. On the second night, when the storm had not broken and the fire had burned down to a steady bed of coals that gave off a deep orange warmth, they talked about him. She asked, because she had answered all his questions and it seemed fair, about Silas Greer himself, where he had come from, how he had come to be a solitary man in the Colorado wilderness, at what she estimated was about 30 years old. He had been born in Kentucky, he told her, the 4th son of a farmer who had more land than money and more children than either. He had been large from the beginning, had grown into something that the farm could barely contain, and at 16 he had gone west with a cousin who had subsequently headed back east after one winter and left Silas alone in the mountains with a trapper's education and nothing else. He had been alone in these mountains for 14 years. "Did you never want," she began and then stopped. "Something else?" he finished. He looked at the coals. "Sometimes. I wanted a family, maybe. But it is hard to meet people when you live this far up." A pause. "Most women do not want a man who smells of elk and lives in a cabin with no floor." "You have no floor?" she asked. "Packed earth," he said. "I keep meaning to put one in." She laughed. It was the first real laugh that had come out of her in so long that it startled them both. It was not a polite laugh or a social laugh, but a genuine, involuntary, surprised laugh, and it rang off the cave walls and made Silas Greer, for the first time since she had met him, smile. It was a slow, uncertain smile, like a thing that had not been used recently and was relearning the motion, but it transformed his face entirely, broke through the weathered solemnity like sun through cloud, and she found herself staring at him in a way she immediately made herself stop. "Packed earth," she said again, recovering herself. "And you find women reluctant." "Picky," he agreed, and the smile stayed a moment longer before it settled back into its usual seriousness. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. She woke to the sudden absence of the wind, that specific quiet that follows a Rocky Mountain blizzard, absolute and ringing, the world outside transformed into something blindingly white and still. Silas was already awake, had already been outside, came back in with snow on his shoulders and ice in his beard, and the news that the snow was heavy but the sky was clear. "We can move now," he said, "if you are willing." She looked at him. She had spent 2 days and 2 nights in a cave with this man, and he had fed her and kept her warm and listened to everything she had been carrying alone for a month, and she felt more known by him than she had felt by most people she had spent years with. And somewhere in the course of it all, the strange, exhausted peace that had brought her into this cave had transformed into something else, something that felt, cautiously and with no certainty at all, like the desire to see what came next. "I am willing," she said. He carried her for most of the 4 miles. She protested vigorously at first. She was not a woman who accepted being carried, not in philosophy or in practice, and she said so at some length. He listened to all of it, and then, when she had finished, he pointed out that the snow was nearly to her knee in places, that her boot was not suited for the terrain, and that the temperature was low enough that another hour of struggling through it on a bad leg would almost certainly result in frostbite. He said all of this without argument or exasperation, just with the steady, factual patience of a man laying out the relevant information and leaving the decision to her. She put her arms around his neck and let him carry her. He was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. Warm in a way that radiated through his coat and into her, a deep and steady warmth like a hearthstone that has been heated over long hours. She was careful, at first, to hold herself very properly, to keep a formal distance, her face turned away from his shoulder. But the terrain was rough and the snow was deep, and he moved through it with a rolling, powerful gait that required her to hold on more firmly than her dignity preferred, and eventually she stopped fighting it and simply held on, her cheek resting against the thick hide of his coat, watching the snow-weighted trees go past. He did not speak much. He breathed steadily and deeply, his breath making great clouds in the cold air, and he watched where he was putting his feet with the focused, present tense attention of a man carrying something precious over difficult ground. She noticed that. She did not say anything about it. The cabin appeared through the trees exactly as he had described it, small, solid, and roughly built in the way of a structure that had been built by one person over time rather than by a crew with a plan. The logs were thick and fitted well, the gaps chinked with a care that spoke of someone who took the cold seriously, and the roof was buried now under 2 feet of new snow, but was clearly steeply pitched to shed it. There was a good-sized lean-to on the northern side, stacked high with enough split wood to see through a serious winter. There was a small corral beside it, and in the corral, a large gray horse and a smaller bay stood nose to nose in the snow, apparently in agreement about the weather. There was, she noted when he set her down inside and she looked at the floor, packed earth. "You really do have no floor," she said. "I told you," he said without apology. The interior was single-roomed and functional, with a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall and a sleeping loft accessed by a ladder on the far end. There was a table, 2 chairs, a workbench covered in tools, and a half-finished piece of what appeared to be a chair leg, and a considerable quantity of dried goods on rough shelves near the fireplace. It smelled of pine smoke and leather and coffee. Despite the packed earth floor, it was clean in the way of a tidy mind, rather than a domestic one. Everything in its place, nothing wasted. He got the fire going in the stone fireplace in short order, a more ambitious operation than the cave fire, banking it deep and sure. He put a dented coffee pot on the iron crane that swung over the coals and began pulling things together for a meal with the unceremonious competence that characterized everything he did. She sat at the table and looked around at the cabin and tried to reconcile the person she had been 3 days ago, the woman sitting in the dark of a cave, wrapped in a single thin blanket, waiting for the cold to finish the job, with the person sitting here now in this warm and solid room, watching an enormous dark-haired man make coffee. She could not quite do it. The distance between those two versions of herself felt too large to bridge in only 3 days. And yet, here she was. He put coffee in front of her, strong and dark, and a bowl of something that turned out to be salt pork and dried beans that he had clearly started on the fire as soon as it was going, with the casual efficiency of a man who did not see any point in being hungry when there was food available. She ate it all. She drank 2 cups of coffee. Her leg, which had been throbbing since the cold of the morning, was slowly unknotting itself in the warmth from the fireplace. "You can stay," he said without looking up from his own bowl. "As long as you need to. I can sleep in the loft. You can have the bed." He nodded toward a low platform near the fireplace she had not noticed, piled with blankets and buffalo robes. "This is not charity. I have a second room to put in at the back of the cabin, and I never seem to find the time to do it, and my winter stores are good this year. It is just a fact." She looked at him. He was staring at his food with the focused attention of a man who has said something he is not entirely sure was wise and is now very interested in his salt pork. "Why?" she said, not challenging, genuinely asking. He looked up then. "Because you are alive," he said, "and I think you should stay that way. And because you have nowhere else to go and I have plenty of room, even without the floor." He held her eyes for a moment, and something moved in that gray gaze, something serious and direct that she did not mistake for anything other than what it was. "And because I would like to know you better, Elara Calloway, if that is all right." She held his gaze for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow-quiet world sat white and still under its clear sky. "That is all right," she said. The weeks that followed were the quietest and most unexpectedly good of Elara's life, which she would not have predicted and could not fully explain, because they were also objectively difficult. Learning to share a small space with another person, with a large and particular person who had his own rhythms and habits, required constant and careful negotiation. He rose before dawn, built the fire back up, went out to see to the horses, came back in smelling of cold air and wood smoke, and started water heating for coffee without making a sound. She discovered that she too rose early, had always been an early riser, and so the first awkward transition was navigated by the mutual discovery that neither of them minded the other's presence at 5 in the morning, that in fact, there was something specifically companionable about sharing a fire in the pre-dawn dark when the rest of the world was absent. He built the brace for her leg within the first week. He spent 3 days on it, working at his bench with a focused intensity that she found mesmerizing to watch, his huge hands handling the small pieces of carved wood and leather with extraordinary precision. He measured her leg, and measured it again, and cut and fitted and adjusted with the same thoroughness he brought to the fire building and the water carrying and everything else he did. When he put it on her and asked her to walk, and she took 3 steps and realized the pain was different, not gone, but different, distributed more evenly, her gait steadier, she stopped in the middle of his packed earth floor and put her hands over her face. "It is too much," she said, and her voice was muffled in her palms. "What is too much?" he asked, alarmed. "Your kindness," she said. "I'm not accustomed to it. It is too much." There was a silence. Then she felt his hand on her shoulder, very carefully, the way he did everything, with enormous care for the size of it. "Then I will try to be less kind," he said, and there was that slow, uncertain smile in his voice, "though I cannot promise it." She lowered her hands. Her eyes were wet, and she did not pretend they were not. He looked at her with those clear gray eyes, and he did not look away, and the hand on her shoulder stayed where it was, steady and warm. December settled into the mountains like a long, serious thought. The snow came and came and came, and the world outside the cabin window was often simply white, The trees white, the sky white, the ground white, everything simplified down to fire and food and work and warmth. Silas trapped through the worst of it, going out for days at a time on his trap lines, and she found, during those absences, a solitude that was completely different from the solitude she had inhabited before. This solitude was inhabited, even when he was gone, by the smell of his wood smoke and his coffee, by the presence of his tools on the bench, by the knowledge that he would come back, would come through the door with snow on his shoulders and ice in his beard, and the long, unhurried competence of a man who was at home in the world he inhabited. She spent the days of his absence reading. He had a small collection of books that surprised her, a Bible and a surveyor's manual, and a dog-eared copy of Thoreau's Walden, and 2 volumes of natural history, all of them clearly read multiple times. She organized his shelves and found a rip in his heavier coat that she repaired with the needle and thread from her satchel. She experimented with his cooking supplies and made a better biscuit than he had been making, which she presented to him on his return with a challenging look, as though daring him to dispute it. He ate too and said they were very good. She made them every morning after that. There was one evening, about 3 weeks into her stay, when they had been sitting by the fire after supper, she with one of his natural history books, he with a piece of wood he was whittling into something she had not yet identified, when the silence between them took on a different quality, not uncomfortable, not tense, but weighted, as though it were carrying something. "Can I ask you something?" she said, without looking up from the book. "Yes," he said. "Do you get lonely up here?" He was quiet for a moment, his hands still on the wood. "I did," he said. "Not as much as I thought I should, but yes, sometimes." A pause. "Less, lately." She turned the page without reading what was on it. "I used to think I was not very good at being alone," she said. "After Thomas died, I thought the problem was that I could not bear the solitude. But I think I understand now it was not the solitude. It was the particular loneliness of being around people who do not really see you." He put the whittling down and looked at her across the fire. "I see you," he said. Very quietly, very directly. She looked up at him. The firelight was warm and steady between them, and his gray eyes were serious and certain, and she believed him completely, in the marrow of her, in the deep part that had been hollow for a very long time. "I know," she said. "I see you too, Silas." Christmas came and went with the simplicity that characterized everything in that high, isolated country. He had a string of dried cranberries that he had been saving, she did not know for what, and she draped them along the mantel on Christmas morning and made a special batch of biscuits with dried apple worked into the dough, and he produced from somewhere a small jar of maple syrup, and they had what turned out to be an extraordinarily good breakfast, and outside the snow fell with a particular gentleness, as though even the sky was doing its best. He gave her a gift. He had been working on it for weeks at his bench, she now understood. The thing she had thought was a chair leg was nothing of the kind. It was a carved walking stick, smooth and fitted to her height exactly, with a shaped handle that curved to the precise angle that would relieve the most pressure from her bad leg. He had carved a small climbing rose along the handle. She had mentioned once in passing that there had been a climbing rose on the fence of the homestead, and that it was the one thing she had been sorry to leave, and he had remembered, and carved it. She held the stick in both hands and looked at it for a long time. "You remembered," she said. "I remember everything you tell me," he said simply. She looked at him, this enormous quiet man with his ice-gray eyes and his careful hands and his packed earth floor and his Thoreau and his 14 years alone in the mountains, and she felt something complete itself in her chest, something that had been turning toward him for weeks, turning like a flower turns toward a window. She crossed the small space between them, with the new brace and the new walking stick, steadier than she had been in 2 years, and she put her hand flat against his chest over the thick fabric of his flannel shirt, and she felt his heart beating under her palm. He looked down at her hand and then up at her face, and every careful, watchful restraint in him was visible in that moment, all the ways he had been holding himself in check since the cave, since the first fire. "Elara," he said. "I am alive," she said. You said you thought I should stay that way. I think so too now. I think—" her voice was very steady and she was glad of it. "I think I would like to stay alive here if you will have me. And I think I am falling in love with you, Silas Greer, which is the most unexpected thing that has happened to me in a life that has had no shortage of unexpected things." He put his hand over hers where it rested against his chest, that enormous hand, warm and careful. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had learned to read, and what she read in them now was something that looked very much like a man arriving somewhere he had not expected to be allowed to arrive. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you told me I could not rescue you and then ate my venison anyway." She laughed, and he laughed, and then he bent his great head and kissed her for the first time, carefully and warmly, and outside the snow went on falling with its Christmas gentleness, and the fire crackled, and the mountains stood enormous and indifferent as they always had. But the cabin was warm, and neither of them was alone. January announced itself with a cold so deep and pure it was almost beautiful, the kind of cold that comes when the thermometer drops below what it is supposed to reach and the trees crack in the night like rifle shots. Silas spent the first weeks of the new year preparing the cabin against the worst of it, chinked every gap twice over, stacked enough wood against the south wall to build a second cabin, and rigged a rope between the cabin door and the lean-to so that he could find his way back if a whiteout caught him between buildings. Elara watched him work and found with some bemusement that she had opinions about the cabin's interior that she had been politely suppressing since December. She had organized his shelves. She had begun cooking with genuine ambition rather than just keeping them fed. She had mended everything that needed mending and some things that did not strictly need it, but would be better for it. Now, in January, she looked at the packed earth floor and told him exactly what she thought. "You need a floor," she said, on a morning in the second week of January, watching him come in from the cold and stomp snow from his boots directly onto the packed earth. He looked down at the floor. "I know," he said. "I could help," she said. "I cannot carry the boards, but I can fit and peg them. I used to do that with Thomas. We built the whole second room of the homestead together." He looked at her. "You want to put in a floor?" "I want to help build this place," she said. "If I am going to live here, I want to help build it. I do not want to be kept." He held her gaze for a moment, something in his expression shifting and settling. "I would be glad of the help," he said. It was a declaration of a different kind, and they both knew it. Not just of love, but of partnership, of the particular equality that the frontier either destroyed or forged in the people who lived it, the recognition that two people could choose each other wholly and still each remain themselves. He hauled the lumber up from Ridgeway on a sledge in early February, a 2-day trip down and back that he made in the kind of cold that made Elara's teeth ache just watching him go. He came back with the boards and with other things, flour and sugar and salt, a bolt of sturdy wool fabric in dark green that he set on the table without explanation, and a small packet from the general store that turned out to contain a handful of seed packets, beets, carrots, onions, and, improbably, a dried cutting of climbing rose wrapped in damp cloth. She looked at the rose cutting for a long time. "The man at the store said they sometimes take," Silas said carefully, "if you start them inside before the ground thaws." She was not, she thought firmly, going to cry about a rose cutting. She was not. She kept that resolution for about 15 seconds, and then she stopped keeping it, and he folded her into those enormous arms and held her with the steady, uncomplicated warmth of a man who understood that sometimes things hit in ways that words could not reach. "I thought you might want one," he said into her hair. "For the fence, maybe. If I build a fence." "You should build a fence," she said against his chest. "Then I will," he said. They put in the floor together, plank by plank, through the long, cold days of February, working side by side at the pace the cold allowed. She measured and marked, fitted the boards, drove the pegs while he held the boards in place with the effortless strength that still, months in, occasionally took her breath away. There was something enormously satisfying about building something with your hands, something she had forgotten since the homestead. The floor went down solid and good, true to level, the wood still smelling of the sawmill, and when it was done, they walked across it together, and the sound was different, solid rather than soft, and they grinned at each other like idiots. "Better," she said. "Much better," he agreed. On a Sunday morning in late February, when the cold had broken enough that the sunlight on the snow was blinding, and the sky was that particular deep blue that only appears over mountain country after a front has moved through, Silas came in from the horses with a look on his face she did not quite know how to read. He sat down at the table and looked at his hands for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said. "That tends to precede either very good or very bad news," she said from across the room where she was working the bread dough. "I have been thinking," he said again, "that I would like to marry you, if you would like that." He looked up. "I know that it is not. I know that the cabin is not much. I know that we are a long way from people and the winter is very long, and I am not." He paused, searched for the right word and apparently could not find it. "I know I am rough, Elara. I know what I am." She set the bread dough down on the table and wiped her hands on her apron and looked at him across the warm room, across the new floor, in the clear February light. He was so earnestly, seriously himself at that moment, this enormous, capable, gentle man with his long dark hair and his gray eyes and his honest hands and his complete inability to make himself into something other than exactly what he was, that she felt the love for him like a physical weight in her chest, like something she could hold. "I know what you are too," she said. "You are the man who built a fire against my death and then carried me 4 miles through a blizzard. You are the man who built my leg a brace and carved me a walking stick with a rose on it. You are the man who hauled lumber in February so we could have a floor." She came around the table and stood before him. "You are the man I love, Silas Greer. And yes, I would like that very much." He stood up. He was so tall that standing put them in very different relationships to the low cabin ceiling. And she tipped her head back to look up at him, and he put his hands on either side of her face, those big, careful hands, and kissed her with a thoroughness that left her entirely breathless. "I will go to town as soon as the pass is clear," he said when they came up for air. "Good," she said. "I will speak to the minister." "Good," she said again. And then," he said with that slow, uncertain smile, "I will fix the floor in the back room I've been meaning to put in. And I," she said, "will put in my rose." They were married in Ridgeway on the first clear Saturday of April, when the snow in the valley had retreated to the shadowed north faces of things and the aspens were putting out their first cautious green, and the road down from the mountain had dried to something a horse could manage without complaint. It was a simple ceremony. The minister was a young man named Reverend Alcott, who had been in the Colorado Territory for only 2 years, and who seemed perpetually surprised by the variety of humans the West produced. And he looked at Silas Greer, all 6 feet 4 inches and 240 pounds of him, standing in the aisle of the small Ridgeway church in his least worn shirt, his long dark hair combed back, his expression one of total, serious, wondering happiness, and seemed briefly at a loss. Elara stood beside him in her dark green dress made from the bolt of wool he had brought back from Ridgeway in February, with her walking stick and her brace and her 2 years of grief and her 3 days in a cave and all her rough and particular life held lightly in the set of her shoulders. And she looked up at the man beside her and said her vows in a clear, steady voice that carried to the back of the small church. There were not many witnesses. The Ridgeway general store owner and his wife had come out of a kind of fond curiosity. Mrs. Aldridge, the schoolteacher, whom Elara had spoken with briefly in the weeks before the wedding about the possibility of an assistant position and who had proven more receptive than expected. A few other townspeople who had known Thomas and who had the decency to be glad for her now without making it complicated. When it was done, and Reverend Alcott declared them husband and wife, Silas cupped her face in his hands again with that particular tenderness and kissed her in front of them all, and someone in the back of the church made an appreciative noise, and Elara thought that the life she had walked uphill toward her ending to escape had somehow, in the space of 5 months, become something entirely else. Spring came to the high country slowly and thoroughly, the way things that have been long awaited tend to arrive. The snow receded by inches up the slopes. The creek below the cabin ran loud and cold with snowmelt. The gray horse Silas called Solomon began shedding his winter coat in prodigious quantities, and Elara started her seeds in the window of the newly floored back room that Silas had finished in March. She had written to Mrs. Aldridge, and Mrs. Aldridge had written back with something she had not expected. Not an offer of the assistant position they had discussed, but an offer to split the teaching between them. The schoolhouse, it turned out, had 32 children enrolled and one teacher, and Mrs. Aldridge was both overwhelmed and principled enough to say so plainly. The pay was modest, the hours were fitted to the school calendar, and the ride down the mountain on Silas's bay horse, whose name was apparently just Bay, because Silas's naming conventions were strictly functional, was manageable with the new brace. She told Silas over supper. He looked up from his plate. He chewed, swallowed, considered. "How do you feel about it?" he asked. "I feel good about it," she said. "I feel like it is the thing I was supposed to do, before everything went sideways. I would like to do it." "Then you should do it," he said. No reservations, no hesitations, no suggestion that a married woman staying home would be more appropriate, none of the complications that most men of that time and place would have manufactured without even meaning to. Just that direct, simple confidence in her that was one of the qualities she loved most about him. "You are very easy to be married to," she told him. "I have only been married for 3 weeks," he said. "Ask me again in 10 years. 10 years, she said, and the thought of 10 years filled her like warmth, like the fire in the cave on the first night, spreading through all the cold places. The rose cutting took. She planted it at the base of the fence post he built for it on the south side of the cabin in early May, tamped the soil around it with her hands, straightened up and felt the mountain sun warm on her face. The cutting was small and looked improbable against the raw wood of the post, just a few small leaves and the promise of a stem, but she had faith in it. Silas came and stood beside her, looking down at it with the same focused attention he brought to things he was working on. "Will it flower this year?" he asked. "Not likely," she said. "Maybe next summer." "I can wait," he said. She looked up at him, standing there in the May sun in his shirt sleeves, his long hair pushed back from his face, the mountains enormous and permanent behind him. He looked back at her with those clear gray eyes, steady as stone, warm as the fire he had built the night they met. "So can I," she said. The summer that followed was the fullest she had ever lived. She taught at the Ridgeway schoolhouse on Monday through Friday, riding Bay down the mountain in the early morning and back up in the late afternoon, her bad leg managing the ride better each week as the brace adjusted itself to her and she adjusted herself to it. The children were a revelation. 32 of them, aged 6 to 14, wild and sharp-minded, and starving for learning in the way that children in isolated places often are, children who had grown up with the mountains and the work and not enough books. She loved them with an intensity that surprised even her. Mrs. Aldridge, who had initially seemed formidable, proved to be one of the best women Elara had ever known. Precise and funny and fiercely committed to her students, she and Elara fell into an easy partnership that became, by midsummer, the beginning of a real friendship. She began calling her Clara. Clara Aldridge, who had been teaching in the West for 12 years and had opinions about everything, began stopping at the cabin for supper once a week. And Silas, who had spent 14 years speaking mainly to his horse, adapted to the expansion of his social world with remarkable good grace, listening to Clara's opinions with his usual focused patience and occasionally offering a 3-word observation that turned out to be completely correct. "I like your wife's friend," he told Elara one evening after Clara had ridden back down the mountain. "She likes you too," Elara said. "She told me you were very sensible, which from Clara is the highest possible praise." "I will try to be consistently sensible," he said. "You already are," she told him. In July, Silas was approached by a government surveying team that was working through the territory, mapping the high country for the new federal land offices. They needed a scout and guide who knew the terrain above timberline, and Silas Greer's name had apparently come up among the men who knew the mountains. The work paid well and would take 6 weeks in the summer months. He came home from Ridgeway where he had met with the survey team's lead, a wiry man named Garrett who had spent years on government surveys, and sat across from Elara at the table with the look of a man who's about to say something complicated. "The survey work," she said. "Yes," he said. "You want to do it." "It is good money," he said, "and the territory needs to be mapped properly. A lot of families are settling up here and they are settling blind. No proper land records, no boundary markers. It matters. Then you should do it, she said. He looked at her. You would be alone for 6 weeks. I was alone for my whole life, she said, until I was not. I know how to be alone, and I am not truly alone anymore, even when you are not here. She met his eyes. Go do the work, Silas. Come home. He went. The 6 weeks of his absence were hard in the way that things are hard when you have become accustomed to a presence, when the shape of the space around you has rearranged itself around another person, and their absence leaves the space oddly shaped. But she taught school and tended the garden that was coming in with real abundance now, the beets and the carrots and the onions all doing well, the kitchen smelling of the things she was preserving for winter, and took supper with Clara twice a week, and wrote long letters to Silas in her neat hand and dispatched them with the supply riders who went up into the high country on their circuit. He wrote back. Short letters, his handwriting large and deliberate and somehow entirely him, direct and careful and without ornament. He described the country above timberline with an economy of language that still somehow made it visible. The tundra meadows, the granite fields, the way the sky looked from above 12,000 feet. He wrote in one letter that he had found a valley he wanted to show her, a hidden thing tucked between two ridges with a spring-fed lake and a view south toward the Sangre de Cristos that made a man feel like he was seeing the whole world. He wanted to take her there in the fall, before the first snow. He came home in August, trail-worn and thin and brown as leather from 6 weeks in the high-altitude sun. And she met him at the corral, and he swung down from Solomon and pulled her against him before his feet were fully on the ground, and held on for long enough that Clara, who had been having supper with them that evening and witnessed the arrival, made a pointed comment about getting very interested in the garden. I missed you, he said into her hair. I know, she said. I missed you too, terribly. I brought you something. He went back to Solomon's saddlebag and produced a flat package wrapped in cloth. She opened it to find a pressed flower dried carefully between 2 pieces of bark. A columbine, the Colorado columbine, blue and white and extraordinary, the kind that bloomed above timberline in the brief, ferocious summer of the high country. From the valley, he said. She looked at the pressed flower and at him, and she thought, not for the first time, that she was going to have to find better ways to thank him for these things he did, these particular and thoughtful things that required nothing from her, but that said everything about the way he paid attention. Show me the valley, she said. September, he said, before the snow. In September, she found out she was pregnant. She had suspected for 2 weeks before she was certain, had not said anything while she was still only suspecting, going about the days of early September with this enormous private knowledge moving in her like a second heartbeat. When she was certain as a woman alone in the mountains could be, without access to a physician, working from the evidence of her own body and the accumulated knowledge of her own mother's quiet teachings. She sat with it for 2 more days, just herself and it, before she found the right moment. He was at his workbench in the evening, the lamp lit against the September dusk, working on something. The man was always building something, fixing something, fashioning something from the raw materials of the world. She came and sat at the table beside him, and he glanced at her in his peripheral way, the acknowledgement of her presence that was one of his most constant small kindnesses. Silas, she said. Yes, he said, not looking up from the work. We are going to have a baby, she said. The work stopped. He looked up, his hands stilled on the wood, and he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before and could not quite name, raw and wondering and very young, in the way that even the most capable people become very young in the face of certain kinds of news. Are you? He began. Yes, she said. I'm certain. Sometime in the spring, I think. April, perhaps. He set down what he was working on and came around the table and crouched before her, eye to eye, and took both her hands in his. He held them very carefully, with the same attention he had given her leg in the cave, the same focused and thorough care. Are you all right? He asked. I'm very all right, she said. I'm very, very all right. Are you? He looked at her hands in his for a moment. When he looked up, those gray eyes were bright. Yes, he said. I am more all right than I have ever been in my life." She leaned her forehead against his, and they stayed like that for a long moment in the lamplight, the mountains dark and enormous outside, the fire warm at their backs. "I want to go to the valley," she said, "before it snows. Take me to the valley." He took her to the valley the following week, on a morning in mid-September when the aspens had gone entirely gold, and the air was so clear and cold it was like breathing crystal. They rode together on Solomon, he managing the horse, and she in front of him, tucked against his chest in a way that had started as practical and was now purely preferred. And they climbed up past the timberline into the raw and staggering country of the high peaks. The valley was everything he had described. It came into view around a shoulder of granite, unexpected and complete, a natural bowl between two ridges, perhaps a mile across, the grass still green around a lake so still and clear it reflected the sky exactly. The surrounding peaks were streaked with early snow, and the aspens on the lower slopes were every shade of gold and amber, and the silence was absolute, in the way that silences above 12,000 feet are absolute, a silence that contains the world rather than being emptied of it. She put her hand over his arm where it was wrapped around her waist. "Yes," she said very quietly. "Yes, what?" he asked. "Yes, it is everything," she said. They stayed there for an hour, sitting on a flat piece of granite above the lake with the horses grazing behind them, eating the biscuits she had packed and drinking water from the spring that fed the lake, and talking about the baby, about the spring, about where they might put a cradle, and whether Clara Aldridge might have opinions on the subject, which Elara was fairly confident she would. They talked about the survey work and whether there might be more of it, and whether the homestead claims being filed in the valley below would eventually bring enough people up the mountain to warrant a second school. "There are children up here with no school at all," she said, thinking of some of the families whose claims lay in the high country, homesteaders who came in with their children and their ambition and no access to the schoolhouse in Ridgeway Valley. Some of the mountain families, their children have never learned to read. "What would you need?" he asked. "A building," she said, "a stove, books." She paused. "Someone to fight for the funding from the county seat. That is always the hardest part." "I know people in Montrose," he said, "from the survey work, government men. I could write letters." She turned to look at him. He was watching the lake, his expression considering, entirely serious. He had not offered this as a performance of support. He had simply heard the problem and begun working on the solution, because that was what he did. "You would write letters for a school?" she said. "I would write letters for anything that mattered to you," he said. October brought the first frost and then the first real snow, and they began the preparations for winter with the thoroughness of a household that had learned hard lessons about the cost of inadequate preparation. Silas's trap lines were running well, the survey work had paid better than expected, and the garden had produced abundantly enough that the shelves in the back room were stacked too deep with preserved goods. The cabin, with its new floor, and the back room complete and a loft that Silas had now properly floored and insulated, was genuinely warm. A different thing from the first winter's warmth, which had been sufficient, to this winter's warmth, which was comfortable. She was 4 months pregnant and beginning to show, and she had never in her life felt more herself. The leg still ached in the deep cold, but the brace was good and the walking stick was perfect, and she had made peace with the particular limitations of her body in the way you make peace with something when you have understood that it does not define you, that it is simply one of the conditions of your particular life. She rode Bay down to school twice a week. The other days Clara managed alone now, so that Elara's riding was reduced to what her body could manage easily, and came home in the afternoons to the fire, and Silas, and the long, lamplit evenings that she had come to love with a depth that sometimes frightened her. Not the fearful frightening, the good frightening, the kind that comes from having something so valuable you can barely believe it is real. Clara came for supper one Friday in November and brought with her, along with her opinions, a bundle of school books she had ordered from Denver and paid for herself, and the news that she had met a man in Ridgeway, a new arrival, a carpenter named Holt, who had come west to build things and was apparently building them very well. "He is sensible," Clara said, in a tone that suggested this was both accurate and slightly surprising. "High praise," Silas said from across the table. The highest, Clara agreed. She looked at him over her coffee cup. Elara's standard, not mine. She sets an impossibly high bar with you. Silas looked at Elara. I have told her I have only been married for 7 months. 8, Elara corrected. 8 months, he said. It is too early to know if the standard will hold. It will hold, Clara said firmly, and went back to her coffee with the air of a woman who had delivered her verdict. The winter of 1875 into 1876 was long but not cruel. There were storms and there were cold snaps and there were weeks when the cabin was the whole world. But there was also the new floor and the well-stocked shelves and the fire that Silas kept with the same unfailing attention he brought to everything. And there was the growing certainty of the baby that changed the quality of the days in a way she could not have anticipated, turning even the most ordinary things, the morning coffee, the bread baking, the sound of him moving in the other room, into something that mattered more because of what was coming. She continued teaching for as long as she could manage the ride, which was into January of 1876. Silas rode down with her on those January days, not fussing, not hovering, but simply there, the way he was always simply there, a presence that made the doing of difficult things significantly easier without making a production of it. She stopped teaching in late January, and the days slowed into a different pace, the pace of deep winter and late pregnancy, of fires and reading, and the small, careful work of preparing the things the baby would need. He had built a cradle. He had spent 2 weeks on it in November and December, working with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, and it was beautifully made, solid and smooth, with small carved detail on the headboard. Climbing roses, of course. She ran her hand along the carved roses, standing in the lamplight with her back aching and the baby moving steadily in her, and felt the tears come with the ease they had been arriving lately, the easy crying of a woman whose emotions had decided that discretion was no longer serving any useful purpose. It is beautiful, she said. He looked at it from across the room, critically, as he always looked at things he had made. The joint on the left side is not perfectly true, he said. Silas. It is not. It is perfect, she said. He came over and looked at it again. It is close, he allowed. It is for our baby, she said. It is perfect. He looked at her then, instead of the cradle, and that wondering young expression came back to his face, the one she had seen the night she told him she was expecting. He reached out and smoothed her hair back from her face with one big, careful hand, and she leaned into it the way she always did. We are going to have a baby, he said, as though discovering it for the first time. In about 2 months, she said. We should probably get a physician, he said. Clara has already arranged it, she said. Dr. Harmon from Montrose. He's coming up in March. He's apparently actually a physician and not a man who drinks whiskey and calls himself one. Silas's expression suggested he considered this the minimum acceptable standard. Good, he said. The baby came on a Tuesday morning in early April of 1876, during a warm spell that had brought the first mud and the first birdsong and the particular smell of melting snow over awakening earth. Dr. Harmon, who had ridden up from Montrose and was staying in Ridgeway, arrived with sufficient time, and Clara was there, and Silas, who had been absolutely rigidly calm all morning in the way of a man who is extremely calm on the outside precisely because he is not calm at all on the inside, was allowed to stay because Elara refused to have him anywhere else. It was a long labor, but not a terrible one. As these things go in the mountains in 1876, not a terrible one. And at the end of it, there was a boy. He was enormous. This was not a surprise to anyone who had looked at his father. Silas held him with the same hands that had built fires and carried timber and set traps and whittled walking sticks, held him with absolute trembling care, and looked down at this new and astonishing thing that was somehow theirs, and did not say anything for a long time. Well, he finally said. His voice was rough. Well, Elara agreed from the bed, exhausted and entirely happy. He is big, Silas said. He is your son, she said. What did you expect? Silas looked up at her across the room, and the love in his face was so complete and uncomplicated that it made her chest ache with the good aching. What do we call him? He asked. They had discussed names, but nothing had settled. She looked at the baby in his father's arms, at the dark fuzz of hair already showing, dark, like Silas, and at the small old face that all new people have, the face that is trying to decide what sort of face it is going to be. "Thomas," she said, "and Samuel. Thomas Samuel Grier." He looked at her. "Thomas," he said. "He was a decent man," she said, "and he was part of the life that brought me here. I do not want to pretend he did not exist, and our son should have the name of someone good." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he looked back down at the boy and said, "Thomas Samuel Grier," in the way of someone testing the sound of something, and then nodded once with the finality of a man who has reached a considered decision. "Hello, Thomas," he said to the baby. Thomas Samuel Grier, who had opinions about most things from the first hours of his life, expressed them vocally. The rose bloomed that May, the climbing rose he had brought her from Ridgeway, and she had planted at the base of the fence post on the south side of the cabin. It put out 3 flowers, small and pink and slightly breathless in the thin air, and she stood in the May morning with Thomas in her arms and showed him the rose the way you show a new person the most important things. "Your father planted that," she told him. "He brought it from town because I had one on a fence once and I missed it." Thomas regarded the rose with the round-eyed attention of a 3-week-old person encountering pink for the first time. Silas came out of the cabin behind her, moving silently as he always did, and came to stand at her shoulder. He looked at the rose. "It bloomed," he said. "I told you it would," she said. "You said not likely this year." "I was wrong," she said. "Sometimes the things you plant in unlikely places come through anyway." He was quiet a moment. "Are we talking about the rose?" "Perhaps," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of him, the baby between them and the mountain morning spread out before them, and the rose, small and improbable and completely real, on its post. The summer of 1876 brought the news that Colorado had been granted statehood on August 1st, and the celebration in Ridgeway was something. Guns fired in the air, and whiskey flowing, and the children running loose in the streets in the way of children when adults have given themselves permission to be festive. Silas and Elara rode down with Thomas bundled against her chest, and Clara was there with her carpenter, Holt, who turned out to be a quiet, solid man who looked at Clara Aldridge the way Silas Grier looked at Elara, which is to say as though she were both entirely familiar and perpetually astonishing. Elara stood in the main street of Ridgeway, the new state of Colorado celebrating around her, her baby against her chest and her husband's hand at her back, and she thought about the cave. She thought about the woman who had sat in the back of that cave, wrapped in a single thin blanket, waiting for the cold to finish a job she had started by walking uphill. She thought about the fire that had appeared in the dark and the enormous, quiet man who had built it. She had written once in her notebook. She had started keeping a notebook in January, part diary and part teacher's notes, and part the working out of ideas she had not had anyone to talk to about when she was alone in the homestead, that she thought of her life as divided into before and after, and the line between them was a fire in a cave in the Colorado mountains on a night in late October 1874. She thought that was accurate, and she thought it was also incomplete, because the truth was more complicated than a single line. The truth was that her life had been accumulating toward something all along. Every loss and every difficulty and every year of walking with a bad leg through a country that did not make accommodations for bad legs. And what it had been accumulating toward was this man, this fire, this mountain, this morning, this child. She did not believe that suffering was necessary for happiness. She did not believe that. But she did believe that the things you had walked through shaped the things you arrived at, and that the particular happiness she had arrived at was built on particular ground that included a cave and a blizzard and a man who had said the right thing at the right moment without knowing it was the right moment. The letters Silas had written to his contacts in Montrose bore fruit that fall. The county seat approved a small allocation for a mountain school, enough for a building. Holt would build it as a matter of considerable logic, and a modest salary for a teacher. Elara was offered the position before it was formally advertised, which felt deeply appropriate. She would teach 4 days a week, she and Clara between them covering both schools, and she would have Tommy in a basket beside the desk in the early months, and then Silas would come to town with the boy on teaching days when she needed 2 hands free. And Silas had arranged this all with the same uncomplicated certainty he brought to building things and finding solutions. He came to her with the whole plan assembled, not as a directive but as an offering. Here is what I think could work. You tell me what needs to be different. What needed to be different was very little. The mountain school opened the following spring in a one-room building at the base of the northern ridge, smelling of new timber and Holt's honest craftsmanship, with 12 children enrolled for the first term and more promised for the fall. Elara stood in front of those 12 children on the first morning, Thomas asleep in his basket in the corner, her walking stick beside her desk, the morning light coming through the new windows, and felt the satisfaction of a life that had found the shape it was supposed to have. She taught them to read. She taught them to figure and to write in their careful, labored hands, and she told them about the world, about the history of the country they were growing up in, about the land they lived on and who had lived on it before, about the rivers and mountains and the science of things. She taught them, quietly and consistently, that the world was large and interesting and worth understanding, and that the understanding of it was available to them, regardless of whether they lived in a cabin on a Colorado mountain or a city they had never seen. 2 of those 12 children could not, after the first week, be coaxed to leave at the end of the school day. Their names were Abigail and James, 9 and 11, the children of a homesteading family from the claim 3 miles north of the Greer cabin, and they were hungry for learning in the way that people are hungry for something they have been doing without too long. Elara recognized that hunger. She had been that hungry herself, in a different life. She lent them books. They brought the books back read and wanted more. By the end of the first term, Abigail could read at a level that astonished Elara, and James had taken to figures with an aptitude that made her think carefully about how to make sure that aptitude was not wasted in a country that had a habit of wasting the abilities of children who happened to be born in inconvenient places. She wrote to a teacher's college in Denver, just a letter, making inquiries about correspondence courses and possibilities for bright mountain children who wanted more than a one-room schoolhouse could offer. The letter back was encouraging. She told Silas. "Good," he said. He was at his workbench, working on something for the new addition he had started on the back of the cabin. The family was going to need more room, she thought, and evidently he had reached the same conclusion without either of them needing to say it directly. "You should fight for those children." "I intend to," she said. "I know," he said, and there was a pride in his voice, quiet and unflashy, that went into her like the warmth of a fire that you have been cold without. Thomas learned to walk in August with the unstoppable determination of a child who had decided that crawling was beneath his dignity. He was built like his father from the very beginning, solid and big for his age, but he had her dark eyes and her particular way of tilting his head when he was listening, and the combination of these things in a staggering 14-month-old was almost unbearably engaging. He walked to the fence post with the rose on it and grabbed the lowest branch with both fat hands and looked at Elara with an expression that said, clearly, "I have achieved this." "Yes," she agreed, "you have." Silas, who had been watching from 10 feet away with the low-key readiness of a man prepared to catch a falling child without making it obvious, crouched down and held out his arms, and Thomas launched himself away from the fence post and across the distance between them with the absolute confidence of a child who has never not been caught. She watched Silas catch him, toss him up, bring him back down, press a kiss to the dark hair, and set him on his feet again, pointing at the next target. She had a notebook in her lap, and she'd been trying to write, but she was not writing. She was watching her husband play with their son in the mountain afternoon, and the love was so large and so ordinary and so impossibly good that she could not do anything useful with it except sit in it. She wrote later in her notebook, "I was wrong about the mountains. I thought they were indifferent. But indifference cannot make a thing this beautiful. What they are is patient. They were here before us, and they will be here after. We are the ones who have to decide what we do with the time in between." The second child came 2 years later, in the spring of 1879, with considerably more ease than the first had managed. Another boy, which surprised her less than the ferocity with which Thomas, now 3 years old and fully himself in every way, announced his opinion that the baby was his, and he would be in charge of it. They called him Henry James Greer. Henry because Silas had had a brother named Henry who had died young, a grief he carried quietly and had only told her about on a winter evening sometime into their second year together. James because James was the name of the school children she had come to love, and it seemed to her a good, plain, strong name for a boy who was going to grow up in the mountains and needed good, plain, strong things to hold on to. Henry James came into the world on a morning in April, which was, Elara noted with quiet satisfaction, almost exactly 5 years from the day she had sat in the back of a cave in the limestone ridge and decided to die. 5 years. She held the new baby and listened to Thomas negotiating loudly with Clara Aldridge in the main room about whether he was going to be allowed to see the baby right now or later, and she looked at Silas, who was sitting on the edge of the bed beside her with the same wondering young expression he had worn when Thomas arrived, and she thought, 5 years. In 5 years she had gone from the floor of a cave in a blizzard to this room, this house with its real floor and its new additions, this family, this morning. She thought about the woman in the cave and felt for her not the contempt she might have expected, but something closer to tenderness, because that woman had been doing the best she could with what she had, and what she had was nothing, and so her best had been to lie down in the cold. It had taken the size of a man and the warmth of a fire to make the nothing into something she could survive on, and from that survival everything else had grown. 5 years, she said aloud. Silas looked at her. Since, he asked. Since the cave, she said. He looked at Henry James in her arms and at Thomas's voice, still holding forth in the main room with considerable conviction, and back at her face. Something moved in those gray eyes, something deep and real and entirely serious. 5 years, he said. You saved my life, she said, not for the first time, but meaning it freshly each time she said it. Some things refresh rather than wear with repetition. You saved mine too, he said. I was alive, but I was not. This. You made me this. She reached her hand up and touched his face, her palm against his jaw, the dark beard that she had learned to love long before she let herself admit it. He turned his face into her hand the way he always did, that instinctive leaning that was somehow the most vulnerable thing about him, this enormous and capable man who had lived alone for 14 years and had forgotten what it was like to be held. Thomas erupted into the room at full charge, stopped dead at the sight of the baby, and stared with enormous eyes. He is small, he said, in a tone of considerable suspicion. He will get bigger, Silas said, as big as me. Bigger eventually. Thomas processed this with the serious calculation of a 3-year-old adjusting his worldview. Then he came to the bedside and looked at Henry James with the focused attention he had inherited unmistakably from his father. Hello, Henry, he said. Henry James, who had been in the world for approximately 2 hours, opened his eyes, which were a very dark gray that Elara thought with certainty would settle into their father's clear storm gray in time, and regarded his brother. He sees me, Thomas said with quiet wonder. Of course he sees you, Elara said. You are the first thing worth seeing. Thomas looked at her with an expression that understood it was being paid a very large compliment, and then looked back at the baby, and something settled in his face. A recognition, a decision, the beginning of a whole future of being the one who was seen first. I will teach him things, Thomas announced. You will, Silas agreed. Important things, Thomas said, about horses and fires and how to build with wood. Elara looked at Silas over their son's dark head, and the smile between them was quiet and complete and full of everything. The cave and the fire, and the 4 miles in the snow, and the brace and the walking stick, and the rose and the floor, and the school and the years and the boys and all of it, every single thread of it woven together into something strong enough to last. The climbing rose on the fence post grew year by year, up and along the fence, and by the summer of 1880 it had covered the entire south face of the fence in the extravagant, improbable blooming that climbing roses produce when they have finally found the conditions they needed. Pink flowers in June, great loose clusters of them, filling the mountain air with a sweetness that seemed almost wrong in the thin altitude, too extravagant and southern for the spare country of the high Rockies. But there they were anyway. Clara Aldridge married her carpenter in the autumn of 1879 and became Clara Holt, though she told everyone firmly that her professional name remained Aldridge, as she had spent 12 years building a professional reputation under that name and had no intention of confusing the children. Holt, the sensible carpenter, had no objection to any of this. Elara stood up for her at the wedding in the Ridgeway Church, in the same church where she had said her own vows 4 years earlier, and cried in the good way. The mountain school continued to grow. By 1880, there were 23 children enrolled, and the county had funded a proper second room, and there was a second teacher, a young man from Missouri named Mr. Webb, who had come west with a college education and a willingness to live at altitude, and who was almost immediately and obviously in love with the Ridgeway General Store owner's eldest daughter, a fact Elara filed away with the same amused attention she had always brought to noticing the ways people felt toward each other. She continued teaching and continued writing to Denver, and in 1881 of her letters bore fruit that she had not quite expected. A representative from the new Colorado State Normal School wrote back with an inquiry about establishing a teacher training program in the mountain regions, a program that could be run through the existing school system, a program that would give educated women and men in isolated communities the formal certification they needed to teach without requiring them to travel to the city for it. She sat with this letter for 2 days before she showed it to Silas. He read it carefully, which he did with everything. No skimming, no impatience, just the full and steady attention he brought to all things. When he was done, he set it on the table and looked at her. "This is what you have been working toward," he said. "I did not know it was," she said, "but I think you are right." "You should do it," he said. "Whatever it requires, we will manage it." "It would mean more travel," she said. "Denver, a few times a year. Correspondence, maybe bringing people here for sessions." She paused. "It is a great deal." "You have never been afraid of a great deal," he said. She looked at him across the table. This man who had been beside her for 6 years now, who had built things with her and helped her grieve and carried her through snow and held her sons in his enormous hands and written letters to government officials on her behalf, and never once, in all of it, suggested that what she wanted was too much or too ambitious or too large for the circumstances. "How did I find you?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "You walked uphill," he said. "You walked uphill in November in the Rockies with a bad leg and nothing to eat, and you found a cave, and I found you." "And you built a fire," she said. "And I built a fire," he agreed. She wrote back to the normal school representative. She accepted. The letter from the normal school changed the texture of the years that followed in ways she could not have anticipated. More correspondence, more structured work, the first tentative sessions of teacher training held in the mountain schoolhouse with 6 candidate teachers sitting at desks they had built for children, Elara standing before them with her walking stick and her brace and the considerable authority of a woman who had been teaching long enough to know what she knew. The sessions grew. More candidates arrived each year. The mountain school became a point of reference in conversations about frontier education, a small and real example of what was possible when someone decided to stay and build rather than leave. Silas built. He always built. He finished the cabin additions and built a proper covered porch on the south side where she could sit in the evenings and watch the mountains go pink in the sunset. And he fenced the entire half-acre around the cabin, not because they needed the full fence for the livestock, but because the Rows wanted more fence to climb. She told him this was an extravagant reason to build a fence. He told her it was a very good reason to build a fence. The Rows moved along it year by year, and by 1882 the south and west faces of the fence were covered in the summer months, and visitors to the Greer cabin. And there were visitors now, teachers coming for training, Clara and Holt for Sunday supper, the families of the school children who came to thank her or ask questions, or simply to be in a place that felt like something was being built. All commented on the Rows. Thomas, by 8 years old, was exactly his father in miniature, large for his age and silent and watchful and possessed of that same quality of total attention when something interested him. He had taken to the woodworking with an aptitude that made Silas's face do something complicated the first time he saw it, a mixture of pride and wonder and the particular humility of a parent who did not expect to be given back a version of themselves. Henry James was different. Quick where Thomas was steady, loud where Thomas was silent, always in motion, always investigating, once found at age 3 at the top of the ladder to the hayloft, with no apparent memory of how he had gotten there, or concern about how he was getting down. They were good years. They were good. They were the kind of good that you only understand retrospectively, because when you are in them, they are just the days, the waking and the fire, and the coffee and the work and the children and the supper, and the evenings by the lamp and the sleep. But there was a morning in the fall of 1882, when Thomas was 6 and Henry James was 3, when Elara came out onto the covered porch in the early dark, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, with her coffee cup and her shawl, and stood watching the sky go from black to purple to the brilliant specific orange of a high country October sunrise, and she knew with the entire certainty of her whole self that she was happy in a way that had no qualification or condition. Not happy despite, not happy in spite of, just happy, full stop, the way you are when your life and yourself are in the right relationship to each other. Silas came out behind her a moment later, as he often did. They had fallen into this habit years ago, the morning porch, the watching of the sunrise together before the day started, and the children were awake and everything became motion. He came and stood beside her, warm and solid, a cup of coffee in one enormous hand, and they watched the light come over the mountains. After a while he said, "Are you warm enough?" "I am warm enough," she said. It was not what he meant, and she knew it, and he knew that she knew. It was just a thing to say, in the vocabulary of two people who had learned each other so well that language was often more ceremony than content. She leaned her head against his arm, and he put the arm around her, and the mountains stood enormous and patient and beautiful in the morning light, and the rose was finished for the season, but its bare climbing arms were still there on the fence, promising to be back. She had been wrong about the mountains, she thought again. They were not indifferent. They were simply very large and very old, and they contained everything without judgment, the storms and the sunshine, the empty and the full, the woman in the cave and the woman on the porch, all of it equally and completely, with the same vast windswept patience that was not indifference, but acceptance. She had come to accept that too. The whole of her life, the broken and the healed, the lost and the found, Thomas Calloway's grave in the Ridgeway Valley, and the cradle with the carved roses, and the school full of mountain children, and the man beside her on the porch in the Colorado morning. She had come to hold all of it without it tearing her, the way a big enough vessel can hold even difficult things. She turned her head and looked up at Silas, who was looking at the mountains with his usual focused, present-tense attention, the gray eyes reading the light the way they read everything, carefully and completely and without hurry. "Silas," she said. He looked down at her. "Yes." "I'm glad you found me," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, in the morning light, with the coffee warm in his hand and the mountains behind him, and the sound of the children not yet awake coming through the cabin walls. His expression was the same one it always was when she said things like this, not surprised because he was never surprised by love, but struck by it, freshly and completely, the way you can be struck by something you have known for years if you are still paying proper attention to it. "I am glad I kept extra wood," he said. She laughed. The laugh rang off the mountains, and the mountains held it, and somewhere in the cabin, Thomas and Henry James were beginning to stir, and the rose was waiting patiently on its fence for spring, and the fire was burning low and steady behind the cabin door, the way it had always burned since the first night in the cave, the way she intended it to burn for every morning that remained. She had walked uphill to die, and instead she had found a man who built fires. From that fire, everything else had followed, the warmth, the floor, the school, the children, the rose, the years. She understood now that the cave had not been an ending. It had been the last step of a very long, very cold walk toward the thing she was meant to find, and she had found it. She was keeping it, every morning, every fire, every imperfect and extraordinary day. Theirs.